scene, and he reads things avidly. He does very interesting work himself, as you know. And so the criteria linked to this sort of foreknowledge of what's happening in the world, and also, if you read his notes over there, are very much related to certain kind of attacks that he wanted to make on Japanese architectural education, which may be something to do with the fact that he was last year made a professor at Tokyo University, and so he's in a sense using the competition as a stick to beat the heads of the local situation. What I think was one of the nicest things that came out of it, despite the fact that some people that are known and published in Japan, like Bronn's work, like Hans Hollein's work, like the work, I've just got a little small piece of it here, of one of the members of Super Studio, that the first prize winner, Tom Heneghan, who's here this evening, clearly was not known at all to Isozaki, so that the suspicion that he may have just given out prizes to all his mates is immediately dispelled, that he, in his report, comments very much on the freshness of approach of Tom Heneghan's project. And also, we were then pleased to discover that Tony Kirk-Smith, who was another recent graduate of the AA, had one of the joint third prizes, and that somebody else from London, the Renton Group, had, I think it's one of the joint fourth prizes. There is then somewhere hidden away in this incredibly sort of English scene the fact that Hans Hollein has joint second prize, and there's the odd Yugoslavian somewhere in the running, but it's a terribly sort of London-orientated result of the thing. And what I was hoping this evening was just partly the people who were involved themselves, of whom there are 3 lots here, would sort of maybe swap notes about the business of doing competitions and this competition in particular. Tom, I feel in a way you should, since you are the winner of the first prize, should have the first say-so. Do you want to comment on it?
He's got to compare a piece.
Is that a good idea? Or am I being too hierarchical about it?
I got everything else going to start.
You're punishing the tray?
Press the middle button of the 3, the middle stick.
Okay. Well, the way I did the project was I did the project about 2 things: the images of people and the way the media project the images. I've got a few slides of Raquel Welch here. And the thing you see about this is that you always get the image of the girl and never the person behind the image. Back home she's got 2 kids, she's a very nice lady, but you never see that beyond the sex symbol aspects of the star. And I consider the way that the media makes us believe anything they want us to believe about the star. And there's one thing, I was walking around Soho Square recently, and I was talking to people in the film industry, and they were talking about this film coming out soon, having a screening on Monday, and it should just be ready for release in time for the Glenn Miller revival. Now this time I didn't know anything about the Glenn Miller revival, and I went home and told someone there's going to be a Glenn Miller revival soon. And it was that time that I realised there was a Glenn Miller record #2 in the Capitol charts. And this thing had been planned by the record industry, the film industry. It had been planned for months. You don't make a film in 2 weeks. And it was obvious at that point how easily the media can tell us what we like and tell us to believe certain things. And this is an image of Michael Caine, how he's suddenly become not Playboy anymore. He's now a home-loving man, settled down with 2 kids. He's a marvellous man, loves the garden. And we read the article, and it says there, well, he's a home-loving man, but is he really? Like, possibly this is just a publicity stunt, and possibly he's still a Romeo. And this is a double bluff, because the people who want to believe he's a Romeo believe he's a Romeo still, and people who believe he is a home-loving man still believe he's a home-loving man. And it's a publicity article, criticising a publicity article, but still being a publicity article. It's a very strong double bluff. And this is Rod Stewart. The problem with this is that a lot of people in this building know Rod Stewart's house personally, but you could believe that it doesn't exist for the purposes of my talk here. And the thing about stars is we must believe that they live like stars, because there's a whole star set up. And if you think that for a minute that he doesn't live like that, then the whole thing about pop suddenly becomes worthless. If you're a pop star, you live in a semi-D, it becomes a bit of nothing. And you've got to remember about superstars that many of them aren't wealthy. To be a superstar, you don't necessarily have to have money. There are many superstars who live on meagre salaries, as many people who know, and who can't live in the way of a superstar, but it's necessary for you to believe that they do, otherwise they aren't superstars anymore. And the thing about this, the Rod Stewart house, is that perhaps Rod Stewart exists, but perhaps the house doesn't. Because you look at that side there, and you go back to the last one, and look at the guitars on the wall, on the top left-hand corner there. And the guitars on the wall, on the top left-hand corner there. It's the same camera angle in that one. Perhaps it's just a stage set in some photographic studio, and they just put Rod in there one day and photographed him a few times. And the house, and this terrible kitchen, perhaps that house is in Florida. I mean, it doesn't look like Surrey, it could well be Florida. But look at the angle of that, the photograph's taken from, and look at the angle the photograph's taken from of the kitchen. And then look at another publication. The angle of the photograph is the same for the kitchen, and the angle of the photograph is the same for the house. But they're 2 different photographs. Then you begin to wonder, now is that house there really a facade with one side of the building on the left, a cardboard facade, and is the kitchen simply a set in a photographic studio taken by 2 different photographers 2 different times? Because you never see the other side of it. And now look at the staircase here, in that publication, you go some of the times again, it's the same angle. Different photographers, the same angle. It would be possible for you to fake the whole thing. Just bring Rod along one day and let him walk around with it. And this is Zahra, of course, a film star whose films I've never seen. I've never seen a film where she's been a star. She of course lives like a superstar. And she has 1,000 pairs of shoes. Like, you could imagine somebody bringing Zahra Gabor along to a shoe shop and putting her there, taking a photograph, putting it in a newspaper. You believe Zahra Gabor's got 1,000 pairs of shoes. And similarly, she's got 1,000 suits of clothes. These are like dry cleaners. It could so easily be faked. And this is Hugh Hefner, of course. Now, the owner of Playboy magazine must obviously live like a Playboy. Is the sort of fantasy behind so many masculine dreams. And so he must have this incredible, sexy pad. But the thing that gives away there is Playboy Mansion West. Now, there may even be only one Playboy Mansion, but Playboy Mansion West implies there's one east, north and south, or possibly is. Now, even if you accept that house exists, do you accept that, but he's grouped a lot of photographs here together, possibly taken like 5 years apart, with Linda Lovelace and Ringo and all this. They're all stars. Now, the photographs could be 5 or 10 years apart, but by grouping them together, you suddenly believe maybe that's his lifestyle all the time. So he always has these stars popping in, and he's just grouped them in one magazine. And does he always do like that, surrounded by naked ladies, or are they just brought in for the day? And the thing about that is that all superstars then become shackled by their image, and they have to live up to it all the time. Otherwise, then they devalue the star system. And then you get architectural superstars. This is Fuller's house. Now, of course, because he designs houses, designs domes, he must live in one, obviously. And this is the most awful dome, most awful house. How can you hang a mirror on that wall? The mirror would be at 30 degrees. And how do you hang it? You've got to go into a separate design exercise to hang a mirror. And you get a stroke of plan. Now how do you get, so you want to come in, you go to the hall, you go to the closet to get to the bedroom, or you go to the bathroom to get to the bedroom, and you walk all the way around to get to the dining kitchen, then to the bedroom. And you begin to think like what Mr. Fuller is always boasting he travels like so many million miles a year. If you had a home like that to come home to, would you go home that often? This is a little bit of a dodgy point, because I'm not quite sure that thing that top one is in his background. I think it might be. And if it is, then that's a terribly good word, because a geodesic dome is an economic way of enclosing space, but it's not an economic way of covering space. So if you're going to have the surrounds open, there's no need to have it geodesic. Because that is in his background, I think it is. Then he's been really stretching the point of having to have everything geodesic. This is, then you come to other architectural superstars, having to live up to their image. Now take this young architectural, this young architectural graduate of the 60s, the early 60s, just out of school, I think. Very clean, very pristine house, and take it a few years later, when Artagram started to flourish, and you've got Artagram drawing show all these service modules. Now, I bet you half of that thing didn't work. It was probably just fabricated for the photograph. Where is it?
It's down in the basement.
Oh, there it is.
Actually, the actual thing.
Did it work? All of it? Did it?
After a fashion.
After a fashion. Well, another one, it could well have just been made for the thing.
And Colin Candle, actually, that's the book.
Well, you see the way that after, when he was first a professional, then it had to be a professional splat. And then when Artagram got going, he had to have these incredible service modules, the incredibly uncomfortable furniture. And of course, the giveaway is the rounded door, which has already begun coming away at the bottom, if you look at the photograph. And this is way back. Because the person involved in Artagram couldn't have a square door, because they were drawing rounded doors. They didn't live in have rounded doors. And this is because Peter was shackled by living in the world he drew. By having to live in the world he drew, the sort of style of life he drew. And because I had to go at him, I thought I'd have to go at myself, you see, because I get upset. This is about how designers are shackled by having to live up to their image. I suppose I nervously call myself a designer. And I had the problem of cutting the hedge one day because the neighbours were complaining. And because you think you're a designer, you have to cut it in a designer's way. And so I cut the spiral. And I stood back and thought how wonderful, and then realised it was sort of a pissy thing to do, isn't it? But you get the point that everyone has to live up to their image, they're shackled by the whole thing. So, on to the project. This is poor Raquel Welch, how she's paid for stardom. Sorry, story. Now, the whole project was about a copywriter making out an article for a magazine that would be distributed to all magazines. And here he selected, Raquel lives like she wants to with all her kids and all his cats and things, things that you don't want to know about a star. It ruins a star. So he's got the problem of making Raquel into a star, a bit like a star. And he's selecting out the photographs of the exterior he thinks would go with a star, and the interior he thinks would go with a star. And then, well, no, you can't see it, but the castle at the bottom left is a good outside, and the TV set in the middle is a good inside, totally unconnected. And then he has to write the article about it. So the idea is that somebody's already written this article as a draft and he's correcting it. And no reds are sexy, you can't have green or whatever colour it was. And then all you had to do to these photographs, perhaps, was simply to get Raquel to pose himself, collage photographs of Raquel onto the print that they already had. And then release the photographs to those magazines. And they believed that was where she lived. Well, not 0.001% of mankind, or even less, knows how Raquel Welch really lives. The rest of us know how she lives through magazines, so we can be told anything. And that's the article coming out in the magazine, and these people believe it. And then there's a moral now, because I thought the project first was really stupid, because all you'd be designing, you just think of the star's image and design for the star's image. And I was thinking that's a ridiculous thing to do, because you can't ever design for a person if you don't know them personally. And you're designing the image. And I remember that when we design housing, we always do design for the person's image, because the image we design for are these terrible things, the housing mix, or how many bulbs I have, and how much square footage you need for a person, for how many people. Now that's as much of an image of people as Raquel's, that's as superficial an image as the superficial image we get of Raquel. And that results in some terribly superficial buildings. And then there's this thing here, there is no substitute for architectural advice, and architecture must be employed. And designing houses for an image like that, this is what comes out of it. It's the Smithson building. So I was going to plug in for some other people who aren't here tonight on this point. About a scheme we did for a competition in Roosevelt Island Housing, where we took the person's image of themselves as being an important point. We took the city's image of the building as an important point, and the person's image of themselves as an important point. And so the exterior was designed to give an image to the city of New York, and that could be large and very grand. And in the interior, we'd allow the people, part of the lease would be that they would be allowed to do anything they liked to the outside. And then, which is not so easy to think, because I think the sort of thing we hoped would happen would be like these self-built things in Newcastle. Or this thing in my hometown. But they'd be allowed to develop to express their own image on the building, instead of ourselves expressing our image of them on them. And I think that's what Isozaki was talking about, because it really is a stupid competition idea. But I think that's what he was after, the way that we express our image of people on them, without thinking of their image of themselves. And that's what I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Where's your hometown?
Sutton, sorry.
Oh, it's not. Does anybody want to comment on that before somebody else does a presentation? How do you feel, Tom, about the competition as a competition? I mean, in addition to sort of sailing out on top of it, but now you've had time to see some of the other entries. I mean, only as many as were sent to us by Isozaki, or if we've rounded up, but let's say all the prize-winning ones. What do you feel you were out on a limb, or do you feel that you would, you know?
Well, I think a lot of people got into the temptation of designing for the image for the star rather than the person. And I sort of backdoor that the whole thing. I know. But I think that's the essence of it. designing just what the public know about the style rather than the person themselves. And it's impossible, like I say, to design for the person themselves who don't know them. But it's too easy to slide into the superficial aspect. That's what I'm thinking. It was a stupid competition.
What?
It was a stupid competition.
Why do you think it attracted 400 entries?
Because it was so easy to enter. There wasn't much, I didn't have to think very much about it.
Did anybody else have interest? I mean, apart from any of you guys sitting here actually going for it? Ron, you want to do your...
You put it on the first slide, John. No, it's way round. Press the middle button, miss that gap. What I'd like to talk about is competitions. And the sort of the reason why I do competitions, and the sort of Jekyll and Hyde characteristic of certainly of myself. There's one side of the architect that is, certainly in my case, the sort of real world, the sort of things you're doing all day long. No matter how perfect that situation is, your working situation, no matter how perfect the job, it has all sorts of influences on it, so that it no longer is pure in that accepted sense. So I think I know I do, competitions generally as an outlet and as a way of getting some sort of purity into ideas about architecture. And then there are two sorts of competitions. There's the very well briefed competition like the current Vienna, where you're matching your wits against a very well-defined brief, a very well-defined place, and trying to decide, for me again in a sort of pure way, what one can ignore and how one can twist the brief and what one can do on the site without any influence at all, or without any influence from a client. So it becomes pure. Then there is this sort of competition, the superstar one, which for me is always some continuation of the work that I do in my own time. Now, it is strange, and Peter and I often talk about this, even when the Archigram office existed, and we were doing many things during the day that we were enjoying doing, they were still influenced by a brief and by a client. And so one always went home, and it's probably an inborn thing, because we've always done this, and did other things that were free of those sort of constraints. And so the ideas competition of this superstar sort, for me, is an extension of that. And I don't think it was a waste of time, not for me, the superstar thing, because it just gave me a reason for extending other ideas that I was already playing with. For instance, this slide up at the moment goes back to 1974. It's got nothing to do with the sets idea, but it's got to do with the idea of labelling places. But it is Buckingham Palace. I mean, that's the connection. The idea of taking a place and doing something to it that makes it another place. In other words, that Buckingham Palace could easily be a Holiday Inn or whatever you put the label onto it. Next. Okay, I can do this. Come on. Sorry. But the sets idea, this idea of making architecture as a setting, I think for me grew out of this project that we did in the Archigram office for a casino. the idea of a basic place, a basic set of structuring, a sort of structuring of a place that was minimal, into which was placed in the sort of movie tradition a setting. And for the project that I worked on this, we made a series of sets within a structure, within a framework. For instance, the nightclub could have been this sort of French chateau setting. This was part of the brief, by the way. It could have been easily the Acropolis, and it could have been in the sort of Turkish idiom. The point was that you could make the place in a very decorator way, or in a very stagey way, something different. And this brief called constantly for this sort of change. And this is sort of dwelt in the back of my mind. And I then, in 1974, as a personal reflection of the sort of idea of conservation, took a look at the suburb that I live in and began to wonder the sort of people that live behind the facade that exists here. This is, to me, the public face of the suburbanite, of one sort of suburbanite, the sort of bank manager, insurance agent. And one begins to realize, quite obviously, that although there's a public face that's presented right down to the similarity of the car and so on, and the dress, but you know that once the guy or the woman enters the house, there's a certain individuality that begins to occur. The guy that collects newspapers and fills his house with newspapers, the guy that's bought the organ, say, from the Odeon Leicester Square and has it in his living room. So there's a lifestyle that's not reflected by the sort of public face that he likes to present. You get the odd nut in the same area. This is all the same suburb. The guy that has bought up a job lot of, I think, plastic stone and is plastering it over his house to get a certain individuality into it. But the interesting thing, of course, is that his neighbour then buys the same job lot of stuff and does something else with it to try and outdo him. But so it consequently becomes the same. So there becomes a public face. So I decided that I had very strong inclinations towards conservation and the preservation of the suburban idea. And I did this project, which I call Suburban Sets. And the idea was that this was the public face. This was the area, together with the planning structure of road systems and services, that the planner was involved in with community groups to decide on the sort of architecture that they wished to present to the public. And then the notion was that behind the public face, the individual could exist, so that the public face was just a facade, and behind this face people could set up their own outward or inward view of their lifestyle. This was the basic rules of the game, that there was a public set, which was the planning game, and there was a private set in which you could set up at will any situation. And I took three situations. I took the architect on the left, who behind again the acceptable public facade of the community could set up the sort of dwelling that he wanted to live in. The guy in the center was a camping nut, and he just wanted to camp in the garden. And the guy on the right was an airplane freak, and he bought a Liberator and was living in the Liberator. And then I went through these individually, just showing how behind this public face these situations could be set up so that you were not influenced in any way by the community. You could play your own game behind the public facade. And this was just played through very simply. The camping set. The photographic setting of the set, the boundary wall of each set was photographically like a hoarding made up of the sort of environment you wanted to live in. This was the camping set again. So he had a choice, and he could change this at will, of the sort of environment he wished to sit in. This is the architect, with all the paraphernalia of architecture, the internal courtyards, the spiral staircases, the module, all the pieces that one recognizes as part of the architectural game currently, or at this time, including the robot and the garden on the roof. And the sort of, in this case, my choice of archigram images to his hoarding. The sort of settings within that set that were optional and available because they were from choice again. There was no one telling you or subjecting you to a particular stylistic vogue. Even the madman that wanted to live in the Liberator could set up a First or Second World War scene that he could live in. I assumed that he might well be an ex-bomber pilot. Then there was a sort of double take on this, that the window onto the public set could have sets within them, so that you could set up a face that you wish people to think you were living within, behind the facade. So there was always, although you lived in this community setting, you could give another clue to the way people might think you lived, even though you didn't live that way. So there's a number of double takes that can take place there. Then when this competition came up, it seemed very obvious for me a vehicle to proceed further with the idea of sets, with the idea of making a setting for a superstar. I had great trouble finding a superstar because I wanted to find a client that it was more or less impossible to know. And I think with the film stars and the writers and so on, it was always possible to get some public image, at least, of what they might be. And Charlie Jenks, suggested the Queen. And for me, it was absolutely perfect. So I started looking at the Queen. And the Queen, for me, I went to Madame Tussauds. I don't know if you've ever been in there. And there's a royal family setting there of sort of plastic faces. And it seems to me that she is the ultimate actress. There's no way of getting beyond this facade. And she plays many roles as this Queen. She plays the Queen to perfection. She's nice to kids, and she knights people, and she smiles, and she drinks tea. and she drinks champagne. She's caught, you think, in unguarded moments sometime, but I believe that they're all poses and part of the act. The family lady. I don't think even that is an unguarded moment. It gives another image of the Queen. The sort of slightly wooden faces, the Royal Navy man. And so I decided that the ideal for the Queen was as it were, a giant movie studio in which the settings that are public for the Queen are made up. There's a Palladian portico as the entry. There's a drawing that I'm doing at the moment of the drive to the portico, which is a mile long. I don't know if any of you have been to the Ledoux saltworks at Besançon, which you make a turn to get to the saltworks, and then there's this drive lined with very stunted trees, and at the end, about a mile away, is the portico. And I wanted this sort of build-up, this sort of crescendo, to the arrival at the royal setting. This was, I imagined a site in the west coast of Scotland, a very remote site, so that it wasn't influenced by having to accept some other sort of urban environment. I took a series of settings then, a public set which is to the right on the drawing, a center set which is ceremonial, which is to do with where the public break through this facade but are within the sort of invited but not particularly friends setting that the royalty have to contend with, the ball, the investiture, and that sort of thing. I've indicated a certain formality to that, some sort of Italian Renaissance setting. And beyond that, I should point out that they are cardboard. Unlike Tom, who presents it as a photograph, the Queen is actually living in this cardboard setting. And then beyond that, there's an official set. It's where she has this interface with officialdom, the visiting royalty, the government, and so on. And beyond that, there's a family set, which is, as it were, another break through the veil, where she meets with her immediate family and relatives and so on. And then towards the sea, which is on the left side, there are then a series of private settings for the whole family, into which no one moves unless invited directly by the individual, where I imagine the Queen could be anything from playing this part of Jane Fonda, say, in Barbarella, or Queen Victoria, which is probably more likely. I think the drawings then explain themselves. The wall to the whole complex is an analogue with Hadrian's Wall, so it's a stone wall with the Palladian front, with a paper-thin Renaissance facade. The interesting thing about this sort of competition for me also is the way, in fact in the production of the thing. I mean the three drawings I have up here are not the three drawings obviously that went in, because one always makes overlays. The original is a paste up, which is the thing up on the screen at the moment, that was then reversed out and then rephotographed and then collaged. So it gains in that it is never a single sort of run through a project. And the 3 on the wall were done over the weekend just before the exhibition as another run through, and I did another set for Jenks, which is different again. And this amuses me no end, the idea of being able to overlay a whole range of ideas around a basic drawing. There are other drawings that I haven't got on the wall that depict the sort of ceremony and so on. This is the coronation set. But I get great enjoyment out of using basically the competition, in this case, to just as a vehicle to progress some things I'm thinking about. It gives you a sort of time scale to work to. It gives you a need to be concise and put things together by a certain date within a certain set of rules. So it sort of clarifies the sort of thinking that's going on. And allows you to then develop the idea even further than this. Okay.
Tony, do you want to make a big comment about it?
Well, because I haven't got them to show, so but
yours is over there. Do you want to say something about your entry?
no, I can try and say something. Should we put the lights on? The light on, I suppose out of the other two, mine's the most concrete, very basic, more like a sort of second-year architectural sort of, school scheme. Turned out, it was turned out very quickly as just a thing that I used because the competition seemed to suit what I was doing at the moment, and I just bent it that way. I had this idea of doing something with the telephone box originally, and I tried playing with flats and everything with it, and so it happened it was a house for a superstar competition, which oriented, I thought, I thought it was a super thing to have a competition, though in itself it does seem a rather silly competition. In fact, it's nice that such things are about. It wasn't as though there was fantastic prize money to aim at or anything like that. It was just a sort of nice thing there, an incentive to work around. And I think, rather than talk about something that anyone could do with festivals, we really talk about competitions as such. I haven't really collected thoughts, I didn't even think I was going to say anything. So I think the way I go about these sort of things is because one is never resolved in one's head at all. Well, I'm not doing it. I always see myself as faulty and all the rest of it. Things like that. So, you have these thoughts going through your head, and there's always splits in you, which is nice to put on paper. It's almost as though you get one thing out of the way and you can start something else clear and fresh. And so to put this on paper, you've got this scale thing. A thing that's very obvious, this is an image that everybody, when you see a telephone box, you know a telephone box. Most people think they know it backwards, but then if you actually stop and go and look inside a telephone box, and you don't just go to make a telephone call and use it as an everyday sort of thing, or go to keep out of the rain or you're sort of walking somewhere. You start looking around at certain details in it. You see lots of other fascinating things about it. Lots of very strange things about a telephone box. The crown, which changes depending on who's on the throne, which is a nice little detail. There's a beautiful detail here underneath the word telephone, you'll find there's a simple thing to let condensation out of the telephone box when it collects on the roof and drain it out to the sides. And the way the door closer works is quite amazing. Hence, these reasons for drawing up parts and sections to show how things work. That part of it actually didn't go into the competition because that was how I started about telephone boxes. The parts that went in were the very basic plans, and the whole thing was sent inside a record jacket, which is the one with David Bowie's standard telephone box. Because I used him for my image, but the other part that I was playing with, which is words, of course, I suppose Mike Gold really inspired me on the idea of words, because he was talking about that at the beginning of the summer, and what words really mean, and you use words, a lot of words. A word like nice is a very obvious example. It means we now use it in a very different way to the way it was used by Shakespeare, for instance. And if you look up any word, and you've got a shorter Oxford dictionary, you find a lot of them have fascinating meanings, or undertones to them. And a word like that, just to spell it backwards. And I mean, I thought this would really appeal to Japanese, where, okay, they read down the page, but they're also used to things that read from, it was equally from left to right as right to left. And so that picks up. And all the time, my mind's playing with two sides of the thing. A word that works both ways. A telephone box within a telephone box to give the thing scale. I was just reading the assessment of my thing this evening that I hadn't seen, and it was suggested that I should put a small telephone box beside the large telephone box outside. There's a thing. I'm not so sure about it myself. The idea of scaling up a thing is taken from this television idea, this pop star image. It doesn't really matter what size. People are so used to seeing people that big. And also people accept things like the Statue of Liberty. And you've got this huge image. So, I mean, the way I went about it, as I say, is just playing with what I had in my mind. And the competition was there, so you used it. And the next one, I suppose, just try and, I'm now into another competition very much more regularly than I would have done otherwise. Having, got someone else when it seems like, a good kick in the pants and then authentic. Somebody sort of thought this was worth mentioning, which it was. Though, personally, I did it as a joke, so I think I'll leave it at that.
People the Remnant group who did the motorbike crowdfunding scheme here now. Would you like to say something about your...
I think quite frankly, the scheme speaks for itself, because really it was a fantasy which was taken with a heavy pinch of salt. There's a big man too, the judge's comments are cryptic but important. Really great as we've done too.
The only thing that intrigues me is that, as I understand it, you did it as a group of people who have an office together.
That's right.
Which is slightly different from the other people who have spoken, in the sense that one talked about doing competitions when you finish the day's work, as it were. And the other two people were technically students when you did it, when you and Tom were both technically students when you did the competition, although you didn't do it as a school program. And in Tom, was it the first or it was the second competition you've been in for? Was it fourth? Oh, the fourth, is it? Oh, no, But I'm intrigued that, this conversation about the worthwhileness of doing a competition and the context into which one does it, whether you do it for the group of people, whether you do it as part of the others. And did you do it after hours?
It was done during office hours. In fact, we had a low point in our program and it was used in there. And I think because it was in the full, we tended to fantasize away from, not that much away, but certainly away from the general line of the practice work. To the extent that I think none of us in the group had interest in mechanical indicators of the motorbike itself. I think at the time the competition, we were considering entering the competition, Evil for Evil was well in the public image, and so quite less than that. The two ideas fit together. And I think we were tending towards a little bit of connection with art there, through rather remote connections. Angry holidays were both ex-holiday students. And I think there's a suggestion there, very quietly, probably indirectly indicated in terms of more balance, perhaps, than underground directly, indicated by the plan's sections, which was done, were treated as a machine drawing. The fellow who joined us in the spectacle, David Sharp, he, in fact, took more the sort of Disneyland approach to the presentation, so we got a slight conflict, in fact, of the team set together between the perspective and the almost working drawing below it. But coming back to the point about why we went into the competition, I think it was just that the idea of the competition set our imagination going. We probably went, I think, a little bit too far in many respects, and on the other hand, I think we were quite pleased with the result we produced. We certainly expect getting a competition by any means.
Have you done competitions before?
One before, yes. Which we went the other way. It was a competition, we remember it, for Sports Pavilion. I think it was Brixton organising it, and we tended to be far too technical. We were at the time investigating new systems of using a space phone, which was present with Heneghan following up, and we developed the idea of using advanced method of developing the mirror system, using the facsimile and analysing the stress in the system. We went into a lot of detail, and we were somewhat horrified when the results of the competition came out to find that the winners were in fact presenting ideas, not technical fact. So I think this competition, we tend to reverse the process, use the technical background, but present fantasy. As far as the competition itself is concerned, as we were going to talk about this week, there was one point that made me worthwhile mentioning. We chose Ethan Eagle because, like the other competition winners, the man himself, in this case, is fantasy. I mean, he's going to become most famous when he eventually smashed himself into a deep wall. He finally doesn't make the jump over the bustle. Therefore, the building itself becomes a monument more severe. I think there's one other central one there. In fact, it takes the same approach that was not so much concerned with the existence of the person in real life terms. It's when the person is dead, there's a monument and memorial to that person. Because the person himself or herself is an image rather than reality. Nobody takes evil and evil seriously. I mean, magazines have written about his private life, and they was trying to sort of camouflage pretty much about it. Various points are said about so-called superstars who are very little known about. This point's really being made by one. So in a sense, I suppose we were setting a scene, we were setting an image for the superstar. But we were making it very easy for ourselves in one respect, because even when he was the image, he is his motorbike. Take away the motorbike and you have anybody else. I think I've got our chairs to say because we really prepare any thoughts on this with respect to talk about tomorrow. I do find a very strong comparison between the schemes, even the first brilliant scheme, because each of the schemes has in fact taken the fantasy angle. I think the competition itself obviously was set up very much with that idea in mind. I'm intrigued to notice that nobody's taken the idea of an actual solid approach to architecture, solid building in other words, which actually could be done.
Research from the Japanese people,
Yes, they have, yes.
who Isozaki sort of downgrades considerably. I mean, I think even all the actual sort of first 5, 2 seconds, 2/3 seconds, whatever, are all from Europe, and all fantasize the Yugoslav one slightly gets into a big building, and then it's only when you get into sort of 14, also around the territory, that you start getting buildings cropping up, and even those, even the ones that he's centres fairly straight, fairly strange. There's something weird about them. They're kind of inverted, fan forms that look like elevations. They begin to solidify up the lower down we go, which is very curious, intriguing. And I'm sure if one reads that text, as I said before, it's largely a stick with which Isozaki is beating the Japanese architectural world with, saying, look, these guys from Europe are able to see the significance of the superstar and see what it's really all about. You guys are just being dirty. Does anybody want to make any comment? Tom, do you want to come back and...
Well, I wouldn't say that I don't think mine's fancy at all, because the idea was that behind the magazine article, she has a real house, which is apart from her public face. So I think mine's a very down-to-earth scheme. It's a lovely mind. It's just an obvious house. It relieves the burden on her to do as we expected of her. I think it's a lovely fantasy. I suspect Ron doesn't even think it is a fantasy.
No. I think for me, it's this sort of, I'm not a guy that likes to make great leaps. And it's all very slow. And it builds up. I mean, the thing I've done is full of bits that one holds in your head and puts down on a piece of paper. I should say that, I did that over a weekend as a set of drawings. But it's a thing that was going round in my head for a long time and has grown out of other things. And it's grown since then. No, I don't say it's fantasy. I think architecture's fantasy.
So you two are both, I know Tom's work from before. There's a similarity with things like sort of tile noises, which goes back, which is another approach to doing competitions, which is a certain number of ideas circulating around your head, and then when the right sort of competition comes along, you just, this comes most clearly through in yours, that it is an extension of the suburban sets project. It's bigger, it's loaded in a certain way, it's a direct extension of it. Or you say, well, I'll do something unusual and see what happens.
I think what I mean by fantasy, coming back on the point, is that the superstars themselves are fantasy. They become superstars because of the public's mind. Make superstars that become known by a lot of people, that become household names. I think that's what I mean by fantasy.
I think it'd be interesting that maybe I should make the final point that Isozaki himself is going to do an exhibition here at ARTNET later this year, and there's a good likely he's certainly coming through London. I think he's coming through next month, in fact. We're hoping he's coming for the rally in July. And so we'll have the opportunity of coming back on him and actually, asking him what it was all about and seeing what he does, because his own work, is very much extraordinary. He does very straightforward, but highly stylized art, but he also does theoretical things that are pretty fantastic. So we can actually get him down and around here and ask him. Thank you all for coming. Blending your work with a bit of that in my too. Next time. Okay.